Michelle was walking to her car after another 16-hour day at the law firm, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with hours worked and everything to do with a grief she hadn't let herself fully feel in almost a year, when a homeless man sitting outside the parking garage looked directly at her and said something that stopped her dead in her tracks. "Your mother wants you to know she's not in pain anymore. And she wants you to stop carrying the guilt about that final conversation. Jesus has her now, and he has you too, even though you've been running from him." Michelle stood frozen on the sidewalk, her car keys slipping slightly in her hand. She had never seen this man before in her life. She had told absolutely no one, not her husband, not her closest friends, about the painful, unfinished conversation she'd had with her mother in her final week, a conversation that had haunted her with guilt every single day since. There was no possible way this stranger could have known any of that. This is Michelle's story, and what happened on that sidewalk changed the entire direction of her grief, her faith, and her life. Michelle was 36 years old, a successful attorney who had built her entire identity around achievement, discipline, and control. 10 months earlier, her mother had passed away after a difficult battle with cancer, and in true Michelle fashion, she had handled the grief the same way she handled everything else in her life. She compartmentalized it, buried it beneath an even heavier workload, and told herself she simply didn't have time to fall apart. But underneath the composed exterior she presented at the office, Michelle was quietly drowning. Her mother's final week in hospice had been marked by a difficult, emotionally charged conversation neither of them had ever gotten the chance to fully resolve. Exhausted, overwhelmed, and frightened by watching her mother slip away, Michelle had said something sharp and impatient during one particularly hard visit, words she deeply regretted the moment they left her mouth. Her mother passed away just 4 days later, and that unresolved exchange had calcified into a private, suffocating guilt Michelle carried everywhere she went, one she had never spoken about to a single living soul. She had grown up in church, her mother's faith having been the steady, quiet backbone of their entire family. But somewhere in the demanding grind of law school, then a competitive legal career, Michelle's own faith had slowly faded into the background, something she still technically believed in but rarely engaged with in any real, personal way. Her mother's death had only widened that distance. If God was real, Michelle reasoned privately, why had he allowed her mother's final days to be marked by pain? And why had he allowed Michelle's own last real conversation with her to be one clouded by frustration and regret instead of the tender goodbye she wished she could have given instead? 10 months later, Michelle was functioning, technically. She showed up to work. She smiled through family gatherings. But she was hollowed out in a way none of her colleagues or even her husband fully understood, carrying an ache she had trained herself to suppress so thoroughly that she rarely let herself even acknowledge it anymore. That particular evening, walking to her car after another exhausting day, exhaustion had worn her defenses thinner than usual, and the grief she normally kept so carefully contained had begun pressing up against the surface, threatening to break through right there on a public sidewalk. Michelle hadn't prayed with any real sincerity since before her mother's death. But walking to her car that evening, worn thin by exhaustion and unspoken grief, something rose up in her without warning, an unbidden, desperate whisper she barely recognized as her own voice. "God, if you're even still there, I don't know how to carry this anymore. I don't know how to forgive myself for what I said to her. I don't know how to believe you're good when you let her suffer the way she did. I just need something. Anything. I can't keep pretending I'm okay." She says she wasn't even fully aware she'd prayed it out loud until she noticed the homeless man sitting a short distance ahead, near the entrance of the parking garage, watching her with an expression she describes as gentle, almost knowing, though she assumed at the time it was simply coincidence, a stranger who happened to glance her way. She had passed that same corner countless times over the years without paying much attention to the people who occasionally sat there. This time, though, something made her slow her pace, though she couldn't have explained why in the moment. The man, older, weathered, wearing a faded jacket despite the mild evening, looked directly at Michelle as she approached, and before she could reach for her keys or avoid eye contact the way she usually might, he spoke. "Ma'am, I don't usually do this, But I feel like I'm supposed to tell you something. Your mother wants you to know she's not in pain anymore. And she wants you to stop carrying the guilt about that final conversation. Jesus has her now, and he has you too, even though you've been running from him. Michelle says the entire world seemed to go silent around her. She hadn't told anyone about that final conversation with her mother, not her husband, not her sister, not a single friend. It was a private wound she had buried so deeply she barely allowed herself to think about it, let alone speak of it out loud to another human being. She stood there, stunned, tears immediately filling her eyes, unable to form a response. The man didn't press her, didn't ask for anything, didn't try to extend the conversation into a request for money the way she might have cynically expected from a stranger on the street. He simply looked at her with quiet compassion and said one more thing. He sees you. Even when you feel like you're running from him, he's still right there, waiting for you to stop and let him catch you. Michelle managed to ask him, through tears, how he could possibly know any of what he'd just said. The man simply shook his head gently and told her he didn't fully understand it himself, only that he'd felt a strong, undeniable pull to say those exact words to her the moment he saw her walking toward the garage that evening. He said this had happened to him a handful of times over the years, moments where he felt God clearly leading him to say something specific to a complete stranger, and he'd learned, through humility forged by his own hard life, not to question it anymore, simply to obey it. Michelle sat down on the curb beside him, right there on that sidewalk, and cried for nearly 20 minutes, releasing 10 months of buried grief and guilt she had never once allowed herself to fully feel. Michelle never learned the man's full name. He told her people called him Sam, and when she offered to help him, to buy him a meal, to do anything to repay what he'd just given her, he gently declined, telling her the only thing he wanted was for her to actually let go of the guilt she'd been carrying and let herself grieve her mother honestly, the way she clearly hadn't allowed herself to before. That encounter became the turning point Michelle didn't know she desperately needed. She finally told her husband, that same night, about the final conversation with her mother that had been silently eating away at her for 10 months. She began seeing a grief counselor. She started attending church again, tentatively at first, then with a growing hunger she hadn't expected to feel again. Michelle says the guilt over that final conversation with her mother hasn't disappeared entirely. Grief rarely resolves quite that neatly. But something fundamental shifted after that evening on the sidewalk. She no longer carries it as a private, suffocating secret. She has spoken about it openly with her family, with her counselor, with her small group at church, each retelling loosening its grip on her just a little more. She's gone back to that same corner near the parking garage several times since, hoping to see Sam again, to properly thank him, to ask him more about what he experienced that night. She's never found him there again. Some of her friends have gently suggested she may have simply encountered someone deeply intuitive, or that grief had made her more emotionally raw and receptive that particular evening. Michelle doesn't need anyone else to be convinced. She knows what she experienced, and she knows there was no earthly way that stranger could have known the private details he spoke over her that night. I'd stopped believing God noticed the specific pain I was carrying, Michelle says. That night taught me otherwise. He knew exactly what I needed to hear, and he sent someone to say it who had absolutely no way of knowing it on his own. Maybe you're carrying a private grief tonight too, something you've never spoken out loud to anyone, something that sits quietly beneath the surface of your everyday life while you keep functioning, keep smiling, keep pretending you're further along in your healing than you actually are. Michelle's story is a beautiful reminder that God sees the specific pain you've been carefully hiding from everyone around you. He knows the words you regret saying, the goodbye you wish had gone differently, the guilt that follows you into ordinary moments when you least expect it. And he is not limited in the ways he chooses to reach you, sometimes through prayer, through scripture, through a trusted friend, and sometimes, remarkably, through a stranger on a sidewalk who has no earthly reason to know what you're carrying. If you are hiding a grief or a guilt today that you've never spoken out loud to anyone, consider letting it out into the light. Tell someone you trust. Bring it honestly to God, even if your prayer is as raw and uncertain as Michelle's was that evening. He is not waiting for you to have it all figured out before he meets you. Sometimes he simply waits for you to slow down long enough to notice him already standing right there, ready to remind you that you were never carrying it entirely alone. Sometimes the message you need most doesn't come wrapped in the way you'd expect. Sometimes it comes from the most unlikely person on the most ordinary sidewalk, carrying exactly the words your heart has been aching to hear.